Marcus Webb's alarm was set for 4:45 a.m., but his body had stopped needing it somewhere around his 42nd birthday. That was 16 years ago. Now he simply opened his eyes. At 4:43, lay still for exactly 60 seconds and began. It was a ritual, not a habit. His grandmother had taught him the difference. Habits are things you fall into, she'd said. Rituals are things you choose every single morning, like a promise you make to yourself before the world gets the chance to ask anything of you. He made coffee the way she taught him to. Stovetop percolator, none of those pod machines that his assistant Diane kept trying to buy him. The smell of it filled his apartment on the 34th floor of a building he'd owned for 11 years, but still felt faintly surprised to live in. Not because he didn't deserve it. He'd stopped letting other people decide what he deserved around the same time he stopped needing the alarm clock. But because the boy from Compton, who used to fall asleep to the sound of the 105 freeway, still lives somewhere behind his sternum. And that boy never quite believed in the quietness of high floors. Marcus Webb was 58 years old. He was the founder and executive chairman of Bridgepoint Telecommunications, a company with 4,200 employees across 11 states, annual revenue of $890 million, and a founding story that 3 different business schools. Professors had turned into case studies without ever once calling him to check their facts. He'd corrected 2 of them. The third had gotten everything right. He'd sent that professor a handwritten note. He kept an office on the 22nd floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles, but he worked from everywhere. That was the nature of what Bridgepoint did, connecting underserved communities to broadband infrastructure, building towers in rural counties that the major carriers had written off as unprofitable, negotiating with municipal governments in 11 states to bring high-speed internet to school districts that had been running on connections slower than what most people got in 2005. The work required movement. It required showing up in places where no one expected someone who looked like him. He flew commercial, not because he couldn't afford a private charter. He could easily had used them twice when schedules demanded it, but because flying commercial kept him honest, kept him connected to the texture of how most people actually moved through the world. Diane had learned to stop arguing about it. After the 3rd time, he overrode her travel arrangements and booked himself on a regular carrier. He flew first class when the route was over 2 hours, not out of luxury, but because 6 hours in a middle seat at 58 with a lower back that had never quite forgiven him for sleeping on a friend's floor for 14 months after his first company collapsed. That was masochism, not groundedness. He traveled light, one carry-on, a leather-bound notebook, his laptop, and a small frame photograph of his daughter Amara that he kept in the front pocket of the bag. She was 26 now, running the foundation arm of Bridgepoint's community initiative, and she had more natural authority in a room than most people developed in a lifetime. He thought about her often when he was traveling, about what the world she was inheriting still asked of her that it didn't ask of others. Flight 2241, Los Angeles to Chicago O'Hare, departing 7,000 A. Marcus arrived at the gate at 6,035. He'd learned years ago that the moments before boarding were worth paying attention to. You could read a lot about a company from how they boarded a plane, whether the agents were genuinely courteous or performing courtesy, whether the gate area was organized or quietly chaotic, whether the first-class passengers were treated like welcomed guests or like liabilities to be managed. Small things, but Marcus had built a company on the discipline of noticing small things. He kept a notebook specifically for observations, not business ones, personal ones, Things overheard. The woman at gate B14 who was reading a book and marking it with a purple pen, underlining with the intensity of someone in a conversation. The older man who'd given up his seat near an outlet without being asked, because a young mother with a stroller and a dying phone had looked at it. The gate agent who remembered a passenger's name from the inbound flight and used it when calling her back to the desk about a seat upgrade. None of this was data in any measurable sense. But Marcus believed genuinely that the texture of ordinary human interaction contained more truth about how the world was organized than most boardroom presentations ever captured. His grandmother had taught him that too. She had cleaned houses in Pasadena for 31 years, and she knew more about power than every executive he'd ever met, because she had watched it from the room it didn't know was occupied. He was dressed the way he always dressed when he flew for business. Dark wool trousers, a fitted navy shirt, no tie, a blazer that had cost $2,400 and was worth it because it looked like it. Hadn't cost anything particular. Clean white sneakers. He'd learned over decades the precise language of clothing in spaces that would rather not see you. How to be legible enough that no one had a reason to stare, but particular enough that you hadn't erased yourself to get through the door. It was a calculation he hated having to make. He made it anyway. He carried his boarding pass on his phone. C2A, window. He'd paid the full first-class fare, $1,847, on the same Bridgepoint corporate card he used for every business expense. He had 2 personal cards in his wallet. One, a black Amex with a limit he'd never come close to reaching. One, a platinum Visa that he'd had for 20 years out of a sense of loyalty to the credit union that had given him his first business line of credit when no one else would. He kept that original card not because he needed it, but because it reminded him that there had been a time when his creditworthiness was a question someone else got to answer. He was thinking about none of this when he scanned his boarding pass, stepped through the jetway door, and walked into the aircraft. He was thinking about the contract renewal call he had at 10 a.m., whether Diane had sent the updated bandwidth projections to the legal team, and whether the leftover jerk chicken he'd planned to eat for lunch yesterday was still good in his fridge. He was not thinking about what was coming. He rarely was. That was the thing about these moments. They never announced themselves. They arrived in the gap between ordinary thoughts, wearing ordinary faces. The cabin crew member standing at the entrance to first class had the particular stillness of someone who had already decided something before you arrived. Marcus had seen that stillness before. It lived in the bodies of people who had built a small territory of authority and were ready to defend it in ways disproportionate to its size. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back with precision, a silver Meridian Airways pin on her lapel that caught the overhead light. Her name tag read Cassandra. "Good morning," Marcus said, the way he said good morning to everyone, which was simply as a fact, not a performance. She looked at his phone screen, at the boarding pass, at the seat number. Then she looked at him. "Can I see your ID, sir?" Marcus paused. Not a long pause, half a second maybe, the kind of pause that contained a whole education. He handed her his driver's license, California. The photo was 4 years old. His face matched it with the precision that 4 years tends to allow when a man has been sleeping well and worrying less. She looked at it, looked at him, looked at the boarding pass again, and then said the thing. "I'm going to need to see the card you used to purchase this ticket." Marcus kept his face neutral. That was a discipline too, one he'd developed not out of timidity, but out of strategy. The face you show in the first 10 seconds determines the conversation you get to have. I'm sorry? The card you purchase the ticket with. We've had issues with fraudulent bookings in premium cabin. It's a new verification procedure. Marcus looked down the aisle. Seat 2B held a man in his early 40s, white, sandy-haired, already settled in with a newspaper open across his tray table. He had not been asked for his card. Seat 3A held a woman in her 60s, also white, unwrapping a neck pillow. She had not been asked for her card. Seat 1B held a man Marcus recognized from somewhere, a tech industry face, a conference somewhere, who was already in conversation with a different flight attendant who was offering him a pre-departure drink. He had not been asked for his card. Marcus looked back at Cassandra. "Is this procedure applied to every first-class passenger," he said, "or just to me?" Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted slightly. "To passengers where there's been a flag on the booking, sir." "What flag?" "I'm not able to share the specifics of our security protocols." He understood then. There had been no flag. There was no new procedure. He had seen this particular architecture of humiliation before, the invented policy, the procedural language, deployed as cover for something that had nothing to do with procedure. He had been building things his whole life, and part of what he'd built was the ability to recognize quickly and precisely when a structure was being constructed around him for purposes that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with doubt. He did not raise his voice. His grandfather, who had marched in Birmingham, who had had dogs set on him for wanting to vote, who had taught Marcus's father, who had in turn taught Marcus, that the man who controls his reaction controls the room. His grandfather's voice lived in him like a low, steady current. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus Webb. I booked this seat directly through your airline's website 12 days ago. I'm sitting in 2A. I'd appreciate it if you could explain to me the specific criteria that triggered this verification flag on my booking, because I have been flying Meridian Airways. For over 2 decades, I have Platinum Elite status on your frequent flyer program, and I have not been asked this question before." Cassandra smiled with her mouth. "Sir, I understand your frustration." "I haven't expressed frustration," Marcus said quietly. "I've asked a question." She called her supervisor from the galley. Marcus heard the radio click. He took his seat. Because standing in the aisle was not where he chose to conduct this, and also because he was 58 years old with a 10 a.m. call, and he was going to sit down. He opened his notebook to a clean page, wrote the time, 6:52 a.m., wrote the flight number, wrote her name, not out of threat, not yet, but out of habit. He had learned that the act of writing transformed information into record, and records had a gravity that memory alone did not. The supervisor arrived in 4 minutes. His name tag said Derek. He was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 32, with the careful grooming of someone who had recently been promoted and was still wearing the promotion like a new suit, a little stiff in the shoulders. He introduced himself with the practiced warmth of airline management training. "Mr. Webb, I understand there's been some confusion about our boarding verification process." Marcus looked at him. "There hasn't been confusion on my end. I asked a specific question about why I was asked to produce a credit card when other passengers in this cabin were not. I'd like an answer to that question." Derek cleared his throat. "We do occasionally ask for additional verification when there's an internal flag." "What is the flag?" Marcus said. Derek glanced at Cassandra, who was standing just behind him. "I'm not able to share the internal parameters of our R." "Then I'd like you to show me the policy document," Marcus said. the written policy that describes this verification procedure, the criteria for triggering it, and the protocol for how it's applied across passengers. If it's a real policy, it's a written policy. I'd like to see it. Derek blinked. I'd have to access our internal system. That's fine. I'm not going anywhere. I have a 7002 departure and 11 minutes to spare. The man in 2B had lowered his newspaper. The woman in 3A had stopped adjusting her neck pillow. The quiet of the cabin had the specific quality of people pretending not to listen while listening with their entire bodies. Marcus had 3 rules. He kept them not in a notebook, but in the place where things that matter most live, behind the sternum, next to the boy from Compton, next to his grandmother's voice, next to the photograph of Amara. Rule 1. See what's actually happening, not what's comfortable to see. Rule 2. Name it, clearly and without apology. Rule 3. Use the power you have to protect people who don't have it yet, not just yourself. That was the part people sometimes got wrong. Power used only for yourself was just another word for isolation. He had not wanted to use what he had this morning. He had wanted to sit in 2A and think about his 10 a.m. call and whether the jerk chicken was still good. But Derek was now standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin on a commercial flight, unable to produce a written policy document because there was no written policy document, and Cassandra was standing behind him with the stillness of someone waiting to see which way the wind would blow. And every single passenger in first class had watched Marcus Webb be asked for his credit card in a way that not one of them had been asked. He picked up his phone. He didn't make the call yet. He thought about it first, really thought about it, the way his grandfather had taught him to think before he acted, because the call would change things. Not just in this cabin, not just for this morning. It would change things in ways he'd have to live inside of. Using power left marks, even when you were right. Especially when you were right. But he thought about his daughter, Amara. He thought about how many times she'd probably been asked for extra verification in rooms where no one else was. About the next black man who would sit in 2A on a Meridian Airways flight and be told there was a flag on his booking. About the architecture of small humiliations, how they added up over decades into something that looked like a normal distribution of human experience, but was in fact something much more deliberate. He dialed. The number rang twice. Marcus, Derek had begun. I think if we just... Marcus held up one finger. Not aggressive, not dramatic. Just the simple, quiet gesture of a man who had run executive meetings for 20 years and knew precisely how to hold a room without raising his voice. The line connected. Marcus. The voice on the other end was warm, alert, recognizable. The voice of a man who had learned to be reachable because reachability was a discipline. Good morning, Raymond, Marcus said. He had put the call on speaker before it connected. He placed the phone face up on the tray table in front of him, the sound clear in the first-class cabin, and said, I'm on flight 2241, Los Angeles to Chicago, seat 2A. I've been asked by your cabin crew to produce the credit card I used to purchase my ticket before I'm allowed to sit down. Other passengers in this cabin were not asked. I've asked the flight attendant and the supervisor on duty to produce the written policy governing this verification procedure. Neither of them has been able to do so. I wanted you to hear that directly. The silence that followed was approximately 5 seconds long. In those 5 seconds, Derek's face went through a sequence of expressions that Marcus would later describe to Amara as the full journey from confidence to comprehension. Raymond Liu was the CEO of Meridian Airways. He was 44 years old, Korean American, the son of a restaurant owner in Oakland, and he had met Marcus Webb in 2009 when Marcus had been a guest speaker at a business development program at a community college in East Oakland, the same community college where Raymond had been taking night classes after working 14-hour days at his father's restaurant. Marcos had spent 40 minutes after the session answering Raymond's questions in the parking lot under a buzzing fluorescent light. He had given Raymond his direct number, reviewed his business plan twice over the following year, and written the recommendation letter that had gotten Raymond into a graduate program at Northwestern. He had done this not as investment, not as strategy. He had done it because Raymond Liu was 22 years old and burning with intelligence, and nobody else in that parking lot had stayed to answer his questions. "Marcus," Raymond said, "I need you to pass the phone to the senior crew member." Marcus picked up the phone, held it toward Derek. Derek took it the way a person takes something that has just changed temperature. "Sir, this is Derek Okonkwo, Senior Flight Supervisor." "Derek?" Raymond's voice was pleasant even, not angry. "Precisely, carefully, not angry. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Mr. Webb is one of the most valued individuals in my professional life and a Platinum Elite member of our loyalty program. I want you to tell me right now on this call whether there is a written company policy that requires credit card verification from passengers in premium cabin based on an internal booking flag." A pause. "I didn't think so." Raymond's voice did not change pitch, did not rise. That restraint was, Marcus thought, probably the most clarifying thing Derek had heard in his career. "I want you to extend, Mr. Webb, a full and genuine apology. I want the passenger manifest documented with a notation of this incident. And I want you to call my executive assistant after the flight lands and schedule a call for this afternoon. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. Please pass the phone back to Marcus." Derek handed the phone back. His hand was steady, which Marcus respected. The man had composure even inside humiliation. That was worth something. "Marcus," Raymond said, "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry. I know you are." "That's not the problem," Marcus said. "The problem is that this happened. The system allowed it to happen. The person who implemented it thought it was acceptable. We're going to talk about that on your afternoon call, and I'm going to have some thoughts about what comes next. Not just an apology, a change." "I expected nothing less," Raymond said. "Fly safe." Marcus ended the call. He set the phone face down on the tray table. The first-class cabin was very quiet. He opened his notebook. The time was 7:04 a.m. He had 16 minutes before departure. He wrote 3 things: name of flight attendant, name of supervisor, and a question that he would think about for the rest of the flight. What does change actually require? Cassandra Briggs had been a flight attendant for 19 years. She had worked first class on transcontinental routes for the last 8. She had a daughter in community college, a mortgage in Burbank, an ex-husband who paid child support when he remembered, and a genuine belief somewhere inside her that she was not a prejudiced person. She volunteered at her church's food pantry. She had friends she would describe as diverse. She did not think of herself as someone who looked at the black man in an expensive blazer boarding a first-class seat and saw a question mark. She would have told you that. She would have believed it. But the call had happened, and now she was standing in the galley between first class and business class. And the evidence of what she had done was sitting 4 rows away in seat 2A, writing in a leather notebook, and every time she looked at him, she felt the specific discomfort of someone encountering the distance between who they believed themselves to be and what they had just done. Marcus knew she was watching him. He had spent decades being watched in rooms where people assumed he didn't notice. The awareness was not paranoia, it was data, the same way all of his observations were data. What you did with discomfort said more about you than what you did with comfort. He was not watching her back, not retaliating with attention. He was working. He was also thinking about the woman he'd seen at the gate. She had been standing near the Zone 4 boarding line when the incident began, close enough to the entrance of the jetway to see what was happening in the moments before Cassandra called her supervisor. A young black woman, maybe 27, 28, in scrubs and a lightweight jacket with a hospital system logo on the shoulder, traveling for work probably. Carry-on bag that looked packed with exactly the calculation of someone who had learned to carry everything they needed without checking a bag, because checking a bag cost extra. Lost time and life had taught her to be efficient with both. She had watched the exchange at the boarding door, not obviously, with the practiced peripheral awareness of someone who had learned to track these situations without appearing, to track them, because appearing to track them invited a version of the conversation that cost too much. Marcus had seen her face when he sat down. She was still outside the jetway, in Zone 4, not yet boarded. Their eyes had met for a half second through the cabin window, that particular kind of recognition between strangers who have witnessed the same thing and understood it the same way. When she boarded, 20 minutes later, she passed through first class on the way to her seat, 24C, he would learn later, an aisle seat toward the back. She slowed for exactly 1 second. When she passed him, and he looked up from his notebook, and she gave him the smallest nod, not sympathetic, not pitying, acknowledging, the way you nod to someone after a battle, not because you fought it together, but because you both know what the feel looks like. He nodded back. He thought about her for the rest of the flight, not romantically, the way you think about someone whose story you've glimpsed and can't complete. She was in scrubs. She was flying to Chicago, probably for a conference, a rotation, a training. She had watched a man in first class get asked for his credit card and understood immediately what it meant. She had understood it the way you understand things you've already lived. He wrote in his notebook, how many times has she been asked for extra verification? Not rhetorical. An actual question he wanted to sit with. He thought about the word competence and how differently it landed depending on who was carrying it into a room. He had built a company with 4,200 employees. He had sat across the table from senators and city mayors and venture capitalists who had been, at the beginning, transparently reluctant to take his meetings. He knew what it felt like to be the most prepared person in a room and the most doubted. He had never stopped being both. The difference between him and the young woman in 24C was not competence. He had no idea what her competence looked like at the molecular level, but he had seen her eyes in the terminal window, had seen the quality of her attention, and he recognized a person who had been paying close attention for a long time. The difference was the phone call, the number saved in his contacts that could make the temperature of a first-class cabin change in under 4 minutes. She didn't have that number. Most people didn't. And the question that sat uneasily alongside his relief at having it was what happened to all the people who were right about everything and simply did not have the number to call. Derek came by once during the flight. Professional, quiet, asking if Mr. Webb needed anything. The sir was gone. Just Mr. Webb, spoken with the care of someone who had recalibrated something recently and was still feeling where it landed. Marcus thanked him and asked for water. He did not make it more than that. Cassandra served him once. The beverage cart unavoidable. She met his eyes and said, "Mr. Reyes. Webb, I'm sorry for how you were treated this morning. Her voice had the quality of words that had been turned over many times, that weren't casual, but weren't performed either. Something in between. Something honest maybe, or the beginning of honest. He said, "Thank you, Cassandra, I mean that." And then, because his grandfather had taught him, that grace was not weakness, and that dignity could hold both fire and generosity, he said, "I hope you'll think about why it happened, not as punishment, just as a question worth sitting with." She nodded. He thought she might be near crying, but he didn't look long enough to be sure. That was her business. He looked out the window at the cloud cover over Nevada. He thought about the question he'd written in his notebook, about what change actually required. Not the call. The call was a transaction, a correction, a moment of power meeting power on the field of one morning on one flight. That mattered. He didn't regret it. But it was not, by itself, a structure. And the problem wasn't individual. It never had been. Flight 2241 landed at O'Hare at 12:47 p.m. local time. Marcus collected his carry-on from the overhead bin with the unhurried precision of a man who had made peace with airports. He waited for the rows ahead of him to clear, which he always did, which he had always done. Because fighting for position in the deplaning line had never once made him land any sooner, and had reliably made him feel worse about humanity. At the end of the jetway, the young woman in scrubs was leaning against the wall, waiting for the crowd to thin. She straightened when she saw him. "I'm Nadia," she said. "Nadia Ose. I saw what happened this morning." "Marcus," he said, shaking her hand. "I know you did. I'm a hospitalist at Rush University Medical Center." She said it without preamble, the way people introduce themselves when they want you to know they're not waiting for your permission to take up space. I see this in the hospital too. Different forms, same mechanism. My attending once asked if I was sure I was in the right room when I walked in to see a patient. I had just finished a 12-hour shift. My badge was visible. She thought I was confused. "What did you do?" Marcus asked. I told her I wasn't confused and I examined my patient. She said it without drama. It was just what happened. They walked together through the terminal, the particular walking that strangers do when conversation has given them a shared direction without anyone saying, "Let's walk together." "I made a call," Marcus said, "to the airline CEO. You probably heard." "I heard," she said. "I also heard what you said to her, the flight attendant, at the end." He looked at her sideways. "The part about sitting with the question," she said. "That was," she paused, searching. "That was the part that mattered more, I think. The call corrected something. The question might change something." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood in the O'Hare terminal while the crowd moved around them. And Marcus thought that his grandfather would have liked this woman very much. He had the call with Raymond at 3 p.m. He took it in a conference room at the hotel. Diane patched in, his notes from the flight open in front of him. Raymond had already spoken to the Meridian Airways HR team and the head of cabin operations. Two things were going to happen quickly. Cassandra Briggs was being placed on paid administrative leave pending a full review of the incident and a structured bias training protocol. Derek Okonkwo had been cleared. He had responded appropriately once the situation was brought to a senior level, and Raymond believed in proportionality. Marcus agreed. "But there's a third thing," Marcus said. Raymond waited. "I want to know how many complaints like this have been filed in the past 3 years. Not the ones that made headlines, the ones that went nowhere, the ones where a passenger of color reported something in the feedback form and got a form letter back. I want that number, and I want to know what your escalation protocol is for those complaints. Because my guess is it's a whole Silence. Then Raymond said, "That's going to require an internal audit." Then Commission 1. Put someone independent in charge. I'll recommend names if you want names. You're not asking for much, Raymond said, but his voice had the particular quality of a man who had expected this and respected it. I'm asking for the right things, Marcos said. An apology to me was the floor, not the ceiling. He gave Raymond 3 names for the audit. 2 were former colleagues from the civil rights legal community. 1 was a researcher at Georgetown who had done pioneering work on implicit bias in service industries. Raymond wrote all 3 down. After the call, Marcus sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. Diane knocked, asked if he needed anything. He said, "No, thank you, Diane." She closed the door. He opened his notebook. He had written during the flight the question, "What does change actually require?" He sat with it now, not to answer it exactly, but to test what he had done against it. He had used his power. The power that had come from knowing Raymond Liu, from 16 years of relationship, built in parking lots and phone calls and recommendation letters written at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. That power had corrected one incident on one morning. It had removed one person from the line of harm, at least temporarily. But Nadia Osei did not know Raymond Liu, the man in 2B, the sandy-haired man who had never been asked for his credit card. He would never know how close he had sat to a structural failure. And the next black man in seat 2A on a Meridian Airways flight, the one who didn't have Raymond's number, the one who would be asked for his card by the next person with Cassandra's certainty and Derek's deference. What would he have? Nothing unless the audit happened. Nothing unless the escalation protocol was rebuilt. Nothing unless someone used the power they had to build something that outlasted the moment of using it. That was what his grandfather had meant by the 3rd rule, Marcus thought. Dignity isn't given, it's chosen. But chosen dignity, real dignity, didn't end at the self. It extended. You claimed it first for yourself because you had to, because no one else would. But then you used what you'd claimed to widen the claim for someone who came after you. He called Amara. She answered on the first ring the way she always did when it was him. "Something happened this morning," he said. "I want to tell you about it." He told her the whole thing, not the version he'd tell in a boardroom or in a newspaper interview, if it came to that, but the real version, including the 20 seconds before he made the call when he'd sat in 2A and held 2 futures in his hands and understood the cost of both. Including Nadia in the terminal, including the question he still hadn't fully answered. Amara was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then she said, "Dad, yeah, that question you're sitting with, about what change requires. Yeah, I think it requires someone with a name to put next to it," she said. "Someone who says, this happened to me specifically, on this flight, at this time, and I am not done until the system that allowed it cannot allow it again." She paused. "You have a name, use it all the way." He thought about the picture in the front pocket of his carry-on. Amara at 26, standing outside the community center they'd opened together in Compton the year before. The morning light catching the side of her face, laughing at something off camera. He'd taken the photo and, later when she asked why he kept it, he'd said, "Because you looked like you belonged everywhere you were standing." She laughed at that. She always laughed. But she remembered he'd said it. "I'll use it all the way," he said. She said she was proud of him. He said he knew. They talked for 20 more minutes about the bandwidth projections and her plans for the Foundation's next community survey and whether he had eaten anything that day that wasn't coffee. He had not. She made him promise to eat before the 10 a.m. follow-up call. He promised. When he hung up, Marcus Webb sat in the conference room of a hotel in Chicago and felt the full weight and the full dignity of the life he had constructed. Not in spite of the morning, because of it. Because of what the morning had asked of him and what he had answered. He had not raised his voice. He had not performed anger for the benefit of an audience. He had not let the system make him small by making him reactive. He had seen clearly, named precisely, and used what he had in service of something larger than the correction of one incident in one cabin. The audit would happen or it would not. The protocol would change or it would not. Cassandra Briggs would sit with her question or she would not. He could not control those outcomes. He had never been able to control outcomes, only actions, only what he chose to bring into the room and what he chose to do with it. His grandfather's voice, low and steady, respect is something you claim for yourself, son, and once you claim it, you never let it go. Not for money, not for safety, not for anything. He picked up his pen. At the top of a clean page he wrote, Meridian Airways, structural recommendations, follow-up timeline, independent audit lead. And then he wrote Nadia Osei's name, because she had been right about the question, and because people who are right about important things deserve to be remembered by name. And then he wrote his daughter's name for no reason except that he wanted it in the same notebook as all of this. I wanted all of it together. The morning and the call and the terminal and the conference room and the 20-year friendship with Raymond and the 3 rules and the boy from Compton and the man he had become. All of it in the same place, claiming the whole story. That was the work. That had always been the work. Not to make yourself invisible enough to survive the system, to make yourself undeniably, completely, accountably real inside it, until the system learned to see you or was rebuilt by people who could. Marcus Webb closed his notebook, pressed the button for Diane. Book me on the first flight back to Los Angeles tomorrow morning, he said. I'm gonna need the whole day.